Monster Professor.
Welcome to the Monster Professor, a show in which we discuss and explore monsters in literature, myth, films, games, folklore, culture, and beyond. I'm your host, Josh Woods, author, editor, professor, and monster expert, and been getting emails and messages from a lot of listeners sharing what their favorite kinds of episodes are. Some share that they like the when I delve into literature and when we discuss monster stories and monsters as characters and treat them as well like ourselves. Others are more interested in those episodes or those avenues I go down in which we discuss monsters as symbolic or how they work psychologically as deep, say, archetypical symbols in the human psyche or something like that is about the level of expertise I bring to it. Um, and, others have asked about, whether it's actually a legitimate field of study in college, whether they can go get a degree in monster studies or take classes in these things. And so I'm going to bundle all of that up today and share with you what I think are the four schools of monster study. Emphasis on what I think, because I don't think anyone else has ever seen it like this or sees it like this or would agree to. And in fact, there are people who listen to this show or people who have been on this show who are professional academics in the monster studies world. I risk offending all of them, all of you, by saying your whole world is just one of four possible schools, because I'm sure, from their perspective, their school and studies all possibilities. But I'm thinking of it more as in what is it about monsters that you're studying, and what are your precepts, or say your presuppositions about monsters when you study them. And so between goals and presuppositions, I think we have four distinct patterns, or I'll just go ahead and call them schools of monster studies, and they've established themselves throughout history, I think. And the one that's most official right now is only the most recent. Actually, not very long ago at all did it start. So I'll share what I think these are and throw myself out there for open critique, because I'm sure not only are you likely to disagree with some of these along the way, you might even point out where I'm blatantly wrong. Feel free to attack me. Just sharing some ideas. So I think the four schools are as I see them. I'll just shout them out here, and then I'll explain why I think what I think about these and share some examples of that kind of monster study. Um, I think one is that, well, you know what? I should back up and say what in the world I mean by monster study. I mean, think about and talking about or writing about monsters in two different ways. One, incorporating them into your tales or your poem or your myth or your religion or your novel or your film or whatever. And that's bringing them to life or using them as monsters in these media. But then another type of dealing with monsters is looking at them and discussing them directly, such as analyzing the monsters or studying the monsters in and of themselves, rather than incorporating them into, say, whatever it is you have, your myth or your poem or your film. And so that second branch is essentially what I'm talking about, where those four schools reside. So I think the four schools, or I'll call them right now anyway, the naturalist metaphysical school, the comparative psychological school, the literary sympathetic school, and finally the identity culture school of monster study. So let's start with what I think is the oldest, which would be the naturalist and metaphysical school. And think this takes us all the way back to the origin of the word monster. You're probably already familiar with it at this point. But it came to English from Old French, from the Latin monstrum, and coming from a Latin verb or form of a Latin verb meaning to warn. And so it was essentially a word that we would use to describe any sort of creature or aberration that was a warning from the gods as something wicked this way comes. It first shows up in writing in English, according to the Oxford English Dictionary. Though, if you're calling me wrong on that, as I might well be, then at least I have the OED on my side. Of all places, in Chaucer's Monk's Tale, where he's talking about Hercules having slain more monsters than anyone else since the world began. By then, first time it's showing up in text in English, it's meaning what we mean it to be now. So that sense that it used to be a kind of warning, like out in the field, your lamb would be born with 6 legs or 2 heads, then you would think, oh no, something bad is coming. It's a monstrum, or it's a monster, and that's what makes it a monster. And so already, I think, if we're going to say pre-literate version of monster study, this naturalist metaphysical school is looking at a monster, let's say the 6-legged, 2-headed lamb, and studying what it means for the future to come. And so it's taking the monsters as a real thing and trying to figure out how they fit or where or how they fit in the larger metaphysical order of the universe. And so I think that's essentially a monster study. But if you're like, well, it's not really a school of monster study until it's written down, well, okay, fair enough. You could be right about that. How about then we go with Herodotus, 5th century BC, in his work, The History. He's going through a lot of travel experiences and things he has heard from other travelers, and he'll log various creatures that we would consider monsters. For instance, he talks about the phoenix as this monstrous bird from Egypt, and then he's describing his impossible life cycles, this like centuries and centuries long life cycle. But even then, as we get a guy discussing and analyzing the naturalist side of these monsters, we're already getting, let's see, skepticism right away, because Herodotus can't even get through his description of the phoenix without pausing and saying, parenthetically, but I cannot believe the story. It's like as soon as we're studying monsters in a naturalist way, we're already doubting whether or not they exist. So this first school very much is concerned with whether or not these things even exist. Um, but you could say, well, Herodotus wasn't really doubting the phoenix. He was just doubting details on its life cycle. Okay. And just mere skepticism about existence or not existing isn't really analysis to the point that it would be a school of study. And I think all of those would be valid critiques. So how about let's push back to the beginning of this school even further? How about to a really weird place or really weird level? Let's go to John of Patmos Apocalypse or Revelation or Revelations, the final book in the Bible. That's late first century AD. And so look at, for instance, in chapter 17, where he explicates the symbolic meaning of this scarlet beast with 7 heads and 7 horns. He's describing this kind of thing. And I think every we can say with this a pretty solid amount of certainty that John of Patmos took his vision or his descriptions with a great amount of sincerity. And when he's describing the scarlet beast, he says, quote, "This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. They are also 7 kings." I think that's Revelation or Apocalypse 17, 9 through 10. And so you're seeing, if nothing else, an analysis of what a monster is or means or how it fits into not only the natural world, but the metaphysical world. Of course, if you believe the metaphysical world enough, then that's just an extension of the natural world. And so there at least we get looking at a monster for what it means, analyzing it, or what kind of qualities it has as attached to the natural world and the metaphysical world. Now you could debate that too. You could say, well, technically that was the angel's analysis of the scarlet beast, not his own, because he was quoting what the angel told him in that vision or that apocalypse. Okay, well, then how about this? You know, by the point we have Herodotus recording these beings in his travels or what he's heard in travels, by the time he's analyzing them, John of Patmos is analyzing them, then we get to, we could look at the metaphysical maps that the Gnostics make, or by the time the Anglo-Saxons are recording dragons flying across the night sky and then noting that this means evil things. Somewhere along that line, we have at nothing else at least established a natural metaphysical school. Now, if you're still saying that, just describing literal existence of monsters or metaphysical meaning or cartography or speculations about their existence, if you say, that kind of stuff that, say, Pliny does or the 12th century bestiaries or Charles Gould does isn't really study exactly, well, then you're just not in that first school of monster study, I think. I think you're going on into another one, so let's go into another one. How about the comparative psychological school of monster study? I think this really got going when the study of classical mythology really picked up steam, it's about the 18th century with the Germans, and I guess the broader European romantics, and that was closely tied to philology as well. This study of words, especially in literature, and as those studies got more and more serious or really started gaining popularity and focus, that was coinciding with a lot of other kind of colonial expansions and global cultural inquiries of other things outside of the classical world, indigenous and otherwise. And you're mixing all those together, and you've got a lot of people analyzing the classical monsters, but also seeing how a lot of these stories or gods or rights or heroes fighting these monsters match up with others. And so you've got people like Max Mueller or Mandhart, or probably most famously Sir James Frazer with his book The Golden Bough. That's the beginning of, I say, another school of monster study that eventually started pouring into the psychological side, not so much just comparing these stories or noting where these kinds of monsters show up in various cultures that we're now seeing more clearly. Uh, but eventually we get into the world of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, where they're adding the psychological realm to that kind of ancient study, building off of course, what has just come before them with these classical studies and these comparative studies. And so you know what? How about a shining example of digging into the psychological or the comparative psychological analysis? Let's just take word for word from Jung. I've got a couple paragraphs here, if you can bear with me through reading them. The reason I'll read them is because if I try to paraphrase Jung, it's going to sound so poor that you wonder, why didn't he just read you and why is he trying to improve on him? I can't, so I'll just he takes the Sphinx, and if you'll remember the Sphinx and the riddle of the Sphinx, Oedipus and the monster that that guards Thebes very ferociously, and whoever can't solve her riddle is devoured or destroyed by her. And you'll probably remember the riddle: four by day and two, or four by morning, two by day, three by night, in which he's like man, because man crawls and walks and uses a cane. Well, here's what Jung had to say about it. He says, in the Oedipus legend, the Sphinx was sent by Hera, who hated Thebes on account of the birth of Bacchus. Oedipus, thinking he had overcome the Sphinx, sent by the mother goddess merely because he had solved her childishly simple riddle, fell victim to a matriarchal incest, and had to marry Jocasta, his mother, for the throne and the hand of the widowed queen belonged to him, who freed the land from the plague of the Sphinx. This had all those tragic consequences which could easily have been avoided if only Oedipus had been sufficiently intimidated by the frightening appearance of the terrible or devouring mother, whom the Sphinx personified. He was far indeed from the philosophical wonderment of Faust. Quote, the mothers, it has a wondrous sound. Little did he know that the riddle of the Sphinx can never be solved merely by the wit of a man. The genealogy of the Sphinx has manifold connections with the problem touched upon here. She was the daughter of Echidna, a monster with the top half of a beautiful maiden and a hideous serpent below. This double being corresponds to the mother imago, above the lovely and attractive human half, below the horrible animal half, changed into a fear animal by the incest prohibition. Echidna was born of the All-Mother, Mother Earth, Gaia, who conceived her with Tartarus, the personification of the underworld. Echidna herself was the mother of all terrors, the Chimera, Scylla, the Gorgon, of frightful Cerberus, of the Nemean lion, and of the eagle that devoured the liver of Prometheus. She also gave birth to the monster Geryon, who was slain by Heracles. With this dog, her own son, Echidna incestually begat the Sphinx. This should be sufficient to characterize the complex whose symbol is the Sphinx. It is evident that a factor of such magnitude cannot be disposed of by solving a childish riddle. The riddle was, in fact, the trap which the Sphinx laid for the unwary wanderer. Overestimating his intellect in a typically masculine way, Oedipus walked right into it, and all unknowingly committed the crime of incest. The riddle of the Sphinx was herself, the terrible mother imago, which Oedipus would not take as a warning. That's mind-blowing, I think, for me. I'm not quoting Carl Jung anymore. He didn't end his analysis by saying what he has said was mind-blowing. These are my words now. And if you want to see more from Jung on that, that one was from The Origin of the Hero, collected lots of different places. I think the symbols of transformation is where I took that from. So really cool. And that kind of thinking into comparing these monsters popping up in other places, cultures, religions, myths, literature, but also looking for their deep psychological significance as psychological symbols or something like that. That continued, into all the way up through, all the way up through recently, but probably the most famous would be Joseph Campbell in his 49, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Jordan B. Peterson does this kind of thing a lot. He did it in his Maps of Meaning and does it in his talks and podcasts and stuff. And so, it's worth noting at this point that just because I say the next school, I'm going chronologically of these things, doesn't mean that the last school has died. There are plenty of naturalist metaphysical monster studies folks out there, from the cryptozoologists, who probably are the number one monster podcasts in the world, or not probably, I know they are. If you, either the true crime people seeing human being serial killers as monsters, or the people looking for Bigfoot, those are the number one podcasts out there. And so the naturalist metaphysical school is dominating that, or the various occultists out there, astrologers, those looking at the monsters as real things and as spiritual existence, or entities in the metaphysical spiritual realm. They're still here. So just because one school establishes itself doesn't mean that the others has died, nor does it mean that they're distinct, because you could of course find people that are kind of both. For instance, you could say, uh, how about D.H. Lawrence, in his 1927 Apocalypse, was sharing his ideas about these things. And, he thought Jung was too restrictive and too systematic. D.H. Lawrence was more like seeing that the modern person could only be fully realized if they like fully associate with like ancient cosmic forces, like the dragon. And he fits every bit into that comparative psychological school when he's looking down into the dragon and the serpent's deep psychological and symbolic meaning for us. But he's also kind of pretty Gnostic like in the true metaphysical reality of the dragon with a capital D. And so that would put him in the naturalist metaphysical school. So he's both, for instance, or like Odell Shepard's 1930 The Lore of the Unicorn. You have the comparative psychological school. You see him as delving into whether, so he's looking at it as something, as a deep symbol, but also discussing it as fact and fiction, when he's discussing the unicorn, not the dragon in this. And then he even starts seeing as the unicorn as something in and of itself, not just a symbol of something else in our psychology, and not merely is it fact or not, but something else is going on. And that's what I think our third school is. I call it the literary sympathetic school of monster study. So with this one, if I put the first school starting with Herodotus perhaps, and the second school starting with the 17th or 18th century German scholars, then I'll say this one starts in 1936 with J.R.R. Tolkien's lecture, which was later published in the Proceedings of the British Academy. His lecture slash essay titled Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics. And that lecture and that later published essay it singularly transformed the field of Beowulf studies, looking at it beyond just an artifact of the Anglo-Saxon age or culture, and started to look at it as a literary epic with literary quality in and of itself. And that's then Beowulf studies took off after that because of J.R.R. Tolkien, who was also the world's leading philologist, or world's leading Anglo-Saxon scholar, and he was one of the leading philologists, and the world's premier Beowulf scholar as well. He was also working on some other things in his career that he kind of kept silent and secret. Lord of the Rings might have been one of them that you heard about. By the time it was no longer silent or secret, people were wondering, where was his great book on Beowulf that he's been working on all these years that we expect out of a Beowulf scholar or out of an Anglo-Saxon scholar? And the truth is, that is it. All of his study and all of his knowledge he embodied in literature rather than just dissecting other people's literature. And how many people can do that kind of thing? Well, Tolkien, and I can't name very many. We don't have many. That's how difficult it is. Um, so, with this literary sympathetic school, I think it's what makes it distinct is it's looking at monsters as monsters in and of themselves, not looking at them reductively as useful images for psychosocial messages, nor is it engaging in the naivete or the mysticism of the naturalist metaphysical school. Instead, it's looking at them for what they are and considers, the effects and the power and the meaning that monsters have as monsters in ways that non-monsters fail to reproduce. For instance, in that lecture, that Beowulf lecture that Tolkien gave, he's responding to critics of Beowulf saying, well, the great flaw of Beowulf, however brilliant it is that it should have just been about human tragedies and political enemies, such as, the fall of a great king, rather than involving literal monsters like Grendel and Grendel's mother and the dragon. And so here's what Tolkien says about this. I've quoted it on the show before because I find it so brilliant, but you know what? You can handle it one more time. It's coming from Tolkien. And so he says, quote, "It is just because the main foes in Beowulf are inhuman that the story is larger and more significant than this imaginary poem of a great king's fall. It glimpses the cosmic and moves with the thought of all men concerning the fate of human life and effort. It stands amid but above the petty wars of princes and surpasses the dates and limits of historical periods, however important." And so he's seeing the value of monsters as appearing as literary entities of themselves, literary entities that when we involve them, the whole story is elevated. And then he takes quite a bit of time in that essay and in others, and especially in his own fiction, in taking monsters, well, taking them as unique entities, just as distinct and unique as their human characters, seeing them as real in the literature as their human characters. That's what I mean by the sympathetic look at them, as well as the literary. But continue to grow, and let's just say, for instance, Jorge Luis Borges. When he put together, along with Margarita Guerrero, that a pronunciation I'm sure I've botched, but that won't be the last. We'll do it more often. In which he's got monsters keep popping up in a lot of Borges's essays, and they took those excerpts in which he talked about these imaginary beings, pieced them together in a wonderful collection. Here, of course, you can find all of these if you read all of Borges' essays separately, which I also recommend. But take this example when he's discussing the siren. Um, in this case, you can see how Borges is clearly believing in the siren for herself as the siren. He's not concerned with whether she's determined to be real or not. He's not concerned with her psychological significance. He takes the position of someone who sees the siren as the siren, right? Was it real or not? It's a literary truth. And so he's taking her both literarily and sympathetically. And you can even see his ironic disdain for those who try to control her with their man-made definitions. And so he says, quote, "Sometime in the 6th century, a siren was, unquote. Hold on, let me clarify. This is his, just in his essays talking about the thing. This isn't one of his stories or one of his poems, right? He's telling you various facts and observations about these things. So in this case, where did I go? Oh, sometime in the 6th century, a siren was captured in the north of Wales and baptized, and even listed as a saint in certain ancient calendars under the name Mergen. Another came through a break in a dike in 1403 and lived in Haarlem until her death. No one could understand her, but she taught people to spin and she worshipped the cross, as though instinctively. A 16th century chronicler reasoned that she was not a fish, for she knew how to spin, nor yet was she a woman, for she could live in water." The English language makes a distinction between the classical siren and the creature with a fish's tail that is called a mermaid. It was no doubt an analogy with the Tritons, deities in the court of Poseidon, that influenced the shape of these latter creatures. In the 10th book of the Republic, 8 sirens preside over the revolution of the 8 concentric spheres of the heavens. Quote, siren, an imaginary marine animal, unquote, we read in one particularly uncouth dictionary. I love Borges. Uh, Now, this school might be, let's say, the least systematic of all four of these. I mean, it's free range exploration, but that might be what you expect if you want to look on, on these monsters with dignity, give them their own dignity and their own unique context. And I guess with all of these, with any school of thought in general, it's going to appeal to those who already feel that kinship with that thing. I think Dana Gioia once said, "Those motivated by pleasure and wonder are those of the type that are drawn to literature that he feels most akin to. Those motivated by pleasure and wonder." I think that's a wonderful phrase. And it's probably no surprise that I'm probably I have a stronger affinity toward this literary sympathetic school than the others. Of course, apparently, I allow myself to indulge in any of them so long as I see fit to do so. But for those, say, concerned more about modern social justice or about identity groups, then you have the fourth school of monster study, according to my categories. And I call this one the Identity Culture School of Monster Study, the most recent of my four categories, because this one began well, according to me anyway, this one began in 1996 with Jeffrey Jerome Cohen's essay, Monster Culture, 7 Theses. Now, it was kind of, when he wrote this thing, it was more like a forward, or not even a forward, really, a preamble. There's this anthology of essays he put together called Monster Theory. It's a great book, and it's a great essay as well. And essentially, he laid out, I mean, he says he has these 7 theses, but they can be boiled down to these 2 lenses by which he wants to see all monsters. Um, and Whether we're boiling down his 7 theses or the very clear presuppositions that he's laying out, even in footnotes, he'll lay out, like, oh, by the way, everyone knows that this specific opinion is true, that kind of thing. But that's how those kind of articles work anyway. And so essentially, his 2 lenses are: one, the monster is purely a cultural construct, and 2, the monster exists only for signifying the socio-political anxieties about identity norms within the culture it emerges from. So, between those 2 lenses, he sees any monster as a purely coded message. And then by decoding it, you can find out which identity group, whether that's racial or ethnic or sexual or religious or whatever, which identity group is being repressed by whoever dominates that culture at the time that monster appeared through it. So he'll look at any monster and see that's only a cultural construct. It's not a thing in and of itself. It has no deeper psychological significance out of the individual psyche. It's not a thing to be considered metaphysically real or naturally real. He sees it only as a coded message that the culture constructs about whatever identity group it's repressing at the time. And so here he explains, I'll quote him and let him explain himself rather than my paraphrasing him. He says, quote, "A construct and a projection, the monster exists only to be read. The monstrum is etymologically that which reveals, that which warns, a glyph that seeks a hierophant. Like a letter on the page, the monster signifies something other than itself, it is always a displacement, always inhabits the gap between the time of upheaval that created it and the moment into which it is received to be born again. And so, there you have his clear distinction um, for well, as he says, quote, the monster can be read only through, not with its culture. Wait, I quit quoting him. I'm trying to back up a little bit. Like he doesn't see this thing he doesn't see a monster in and of itself. He doesn't think that it coexists with its context, but only it's something to be read through. So, quote, he says, the monster can be read only through. For the monster, pure culture is nothing of itself. And so I think that's a clear distinction between, how Jeffrey Jerome Cohen thinks, or at least how he thought in the mid 90s. He kind of eventually abandoned monster studies and went on to other things. I think he's now in the ecological concerns of the world focused on that. So it's very rare that anybody can draw him back in, even though this kind of school of monster study, this identity culture one, has really taken off. Of all the four, it's the only one that kind of snuck its way into the academy and into the university to get serious consideration. So I haven't really shown you how he sees that, though. I've kind of explained in abstract and let him explain. But let's how about this? Through those lenses, he applies this kind of school of analysis to the early 90s, mid 90s reemergence of vampires. And so he saw that, through these lenses, as seeing a monster only as a cultural thing, to be decoded so you could find out which identity groups were being repressed. He saw the vampire as a code about the anxieties, about gender norms, about homosexuality, about AIDS in the 90s. So he says, quote, Anne Rice has given the myth a modern rewriting in which homosexuality and vampirism have been conjoined, hypothesized. That she has created a pulp culture phenomenon in the process is not insignificant, especially at a time when gender as a construct has been scrutinized at almost every social register. Francis Coppola's recent blockbuster, Bram Stoker's Dracula, in that one, the homosexual subtext present, at least since the appearance of Sheridan Le Fanu's lesbian Lamia, has, like the red corpuscles that serve the film's leitmotif, risen to the surface primarily as an AIDS awareness that transforms the disease of vampirism into a sadistic and very medieval form of redemption through the torments of the body in pain. No coincidence, then, that Coppola was putting together a documentary on AIDS at the same time he was working on Dracula. And so many the academic papers that follow in that anthology follow that same mode for the most part. And now many more continue to. And so, for quite some time, discussing monsters or taking them seriously in any way, shape, or form in the academy or in college, universities, was basically disregarded or excluded entirely. It was seen as silly kid stuff. Every now and then it could, slide into literature classes, but only through the world of literature, maybe a little bit of film. It was definitely not something you could major in. But since 1996, more and more scholars either already loved monsters and used Jeffrey Jerome Cohen's path as their excuse to write about them in their academic careers, or perhaps they were entirely sincerely focused on identity culture through these lenses, seeing monsters only as a coded identity culture message. And so since 1996, more and more of that has popped up. And so, if you take, say, a monster theory or a monster studies class in college, it's most likely going to be in this school. But that's, I say, uh, whatever you say about this school, it's the one that is succeeding in the academy, two that is actually getting people to officially learn 4 credit hours on this thing, with some exceptions. I mean, you could say the literature classes that focus specifically on monsters might be more in the literary sincerity school, but are there monster literature degrees? Not that I know of. Are there monster study degrees? Well, if there aren't quite officially yet, just wait another year or two because it's happening, man. More and more of these conferences are showing up, more and more of these papers are being published in journals emerging, and schools of study are emerging. Some of the people at the forefront of that have been on this podcast, and so they're doing a lot to bring monster studies into the university. And so this is the one that kind of slid its way. I say recently, as in when this podcast started, a handful of years back, I don't even think it was a possibility to major in monster studies. And now in 2022, I think it might very well be, or if not, it will be very soon. So it has grown even in the short life of this podcast. Not that I had anything to do with it at all, nor would the true monster professors really even consider me one of them. I don't really know if they would or not. I guess that's their business, not mine. So, and since this school has kind of slid its way into academic approval, then maybe the door is cracked for other such approaches to slide in. The naturalist metaphysics school might be harder to slide in, but the comparative psychological school had died out in the academy. Maybe that can slide back in. The literary sincerity. Basically, the fact that I can slide into colleges or into academia in one way or another now with my approach to monsters, which is a quite chaotic random collage, I think, more than a systematic one, shows a lot of what does it show? It shows the universal appeal to monsters, no matter how you're going to study it. Even if you have no agreement whatsoever with whatever I said are the four schools, if you've made it this far into this podcast, you have some interest in monsters. So whatever that is, or however you're interested in it, I say keep going with it and see what happens. Maybe you can take any of these schools to the next level. Maybe you can mix and blend them in such a way that absolutely destroys my categories, or maybe you can establish your own. I have no idea. But for to round this up, I guess, for the people kind of curious and about like, am I one of these monster studies people, or why don't I talk more about the psychological side or the literary side? I think all of those are valid schools of monster analysis. Even those, say, of the naturalist metaphysical school I have had on here, some of the occultists, for instance. These are all approaches to monsters. I can't help but be a little bit interested in all of them, no matter what. So maybe that has, if nothing else, kind of laid out that there's not just one approach to it, that there are many different traditions throughout history. I don't know if any of that is useful to you or not, or you found it interesting, but if nothing else, if you made it this far, then you survived another episode of The Monster Professor. Stay tuned for more episodes soon.